is one of the primary roots of Riya, and so there are three signs of such love. The first one is to love to be praised. And the second one is to dislike or have an aversion to being dispraised because of the pain that it causes, and finally looking greedily at what people have, what is in the hands of people. So he mentions that this is indicated in one of the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated from Abu Musa radiallahu an, where he says that جاء رجل إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال يا رسول الله أرأيت الرجل يقاتل شجاعة ويقاتل حمية ويقاتل رياء فأي ذلك في سبيل الله فقال من قاتل لتكون كلمات الله هي أولى فهو في سبيل الله. So this is where Abu Musa is narrating a story where a man came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked him, what do you think, or how do you see the condition of a man who fights for shujaa, for bravery, or for courage, out of courage? Or how do you see the condition of a man who fights, but he's fighting to avoid the people's negative opinions? He's looking to maintain a certain status in their eyes. And lastly, how do you look at the one who fights out of a sense of riya? Notice he wants to be seen by the people. And he says, in response to that, he says that the one who fights in order that the words of Allah are uppermost, then that is the one that is fighting in the path of Allah. Because that was the part, is that how do you see a person who fights for one of these three causes? Which one is in the path of Allah? Fi sabilillah. And then when he answered, he said, it is the one that fights so that the word of Allah is uppermost. That is the one that fights in the path of Allah. So he's alluding to these three conditions that he mentioned earlier from this, that are mentioned in this hadith. The first one is fighting for shujaa. He's looking to be praised for a certain quality, or at least the perception of a certain quality. Because if we remember some of the stories from the Sunnah about men who, the companions, when they looked at them, they swore up and down that this was one of the most brave men possible. And in one instance, the Prophet said, Wallahi, I've seen him in the hellfire. And they were very confused as to why this was. And so one battle, the story goes that he fought. He was fighting very courageously, but he took some injuries. He disappeared off away from the group, and he threw himself on his sword. So although he had been fighting so courageously, he had this very weak courage in the truest sense of the word in his heart. So when he took some injuries, rather than showing true shujaa, true courage, he threw himself upon his sword and killed himself, which of course earned him punishment in hell for that, and to continually be throwing himself upon his sword in Jahannam. So that's an example of somebody fighting for shujaa, but it's according to appearances. We don't know the realities. Another one, hamiyah, is that, and he mentions this later in the book, he says that most people, they like to be praised. It's not something that people generally are like, no, don't say nothing nice about me. If they do, it's usually because they're putting on airs, they're putting on a show to make it look like they're humble. But it's not truly the case many times. But most of us, we like to be praised. Whether we openly admit to the fact that we like to be praised or not is a different question, but we like praise. We like to hear good things said about us. But he said, many people, he said, whether they, if they like praise, they dislike being spoken badly about. Nobody likes to be the one who's made to look bad, is cast down, is made a mockery, especially if it's unjustly. But to be made a mockery, he said, so that you might find somebody, they don't necessarily fight for courage, but they're fighting, and this is an example, this story actually is an example somewhat. It's fighting, it appears courageous, but the reality is it's not from courage. It's from a fear of being looked down upon in the eyes of people. And so they fight and they fight and they fight. They look courageous, but the reality is in their heart, there's nothing courageous in their heart at all. They're avoiding the pain that comes from the dispraise of the people. And so they're fighting to do this. And then lastly, he mentions the state of riya, or looking for what's in the hands of people. So he says that the one that fights for the sense of riya, to be seen and to gain this status in people's hearts because of the way that he's behaving. So all of these are different examples or indications of how they act. And so he begins to talk about, and he mentions how they would like being praised by people, but he does not like them being dispraised, as in the case of the person who, though a coward, does not flee. So it's the best remedy for such a person, as well as the person who likes to be praised by people, is to think over the whole thing that leads him to commit Riya. What is it that leads you to do such a thing? And to recall the tremendous consequences of this flaw. In other words, part of the remedy is to understand the true nature of the disease. Most of us, like, if we only recently find out that our cholesterol is high, we didn't take it very seriously before, but then the doctor sits us down and he gives us a long talk about the seriousness of our high cholesterol and what can happen and all of the different things that come about. I had this experience when I first learned about sleep apnea. I didn't take it very seriously, but I finally went and got checked. And then as I'm sitting in the office and I'm waiting for my sleep assessment, I'm reading a brochure on apnea. And there's this massive list of all these ailments and conditions that are worsened because of apnea. And I look at that now and I'm going, oh my God, I should have had this checked out years ago. Because I realized the seriousness of it. We didn't appreciate it. And that same thing like with cholesterol or obesity, being if we're overweight or something like that, et cetera, we don't appreciate the seriousness until we're confronted with the facts. And then when we're confronted with the facts, it makes it easier for us to make the hard choices of changing our diet, starting to work out, or do other things like this, et cetera. So to recall the tremendous consequences, understand the reality of the disease. Because this is, we're talking, the title of the chapter is Dawa Riya, is the remedy or the cure for Riya. The reason that there is a cure is because it is a da, it is a disease. It is a sickness, and so you need to seek the cure. And as the Prophet ﷺ alluded to, Allah did not create any disease except that He also created its cure. So for all of the diseases, and it's not just bodily. We think of bodily diseases usually when we hear this statement of the Prophet, but it also includes diseases of the heart. For every disease, there is a cure. We just have to be willing to look into the cure and implement its steps and its conditions. Then you'll realize, in spite of its being pleasant at the moment, it's harmful in the end. In other words, sometimes things are pleasant in the moment. This is where we battle with ourselves, is whether we're seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. If we understand the reality of things, no matter if there's a little bit of pleasure in the beginning, we realize the reality is that there's a lot of pain in the end. And that we know that the Jahannam, adhabin alim, it's a painful punishment in the fires of Jahannam. So it's quite rational then that you would avoid it from the very beginning. If you understand its ultimate consequence, you avoid it straight from the beginning. You don't even let it begin to enter into a situation where it causes you problems. And so he continues on talking about the next one. It's been pointed above. Looking greedily at what the people have is one of the main roots of Riya. This was another one that he mentioned. And so man can remove the root by comprehending the fact that it is only Allah that provides. And so in this, see if I can find it. But he mentions the fact that if you understand that the people, they don't have any control. They can't even really benefit themselves or prevent harm from themselves. What more can they do for you? This is, actually, as I was reading this, I was thinking of one of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said that even if all of mankind and jinn gathered together to do you harm, they could not do you harm unless Allah had written it for you. In other words, it doesn't matter if the whole of creation wanted to cause harm to you. Unless Allah desires it, it's not going to happen. So why worry about what their concerns are, what their opinions are? What is your position with them? Because at the end, your position with them has no bearing on the outcome. But your position with Allah, this has a great influence on the outcome. So why not pay attention to that condition, that influence? And so whoever looks greedily at the possession of others is not free from humiliation and loss. Even if he gets any of these things, possessions, how can he then leave that which is in the hands of Allah for the sake of a deceptive desire which is in the hands of people? They mentioned the second element of Riya, which is to ward it off immediately when it comes into the mind or the heart. So this is acquired through much practice and strife against. You have to fight against your desires, is what he alludes to here, is to when you're afflicted with Riya, you habituate yourself with contentment with Allah's bounties and not seeking to get what others have. And so this is, again, talking about what is in the hands of people, not going after what's in the hands of people. And there's actually the hadith in the 40 hadith of An-Nawawi where it said, izhad fi dunya yuhibbik Allah, wa izhad fi ma indi nas yuhibbik an-nas. That show zuhd, show this restraint and this detachment from what is in the dunya, and Allah will love you. and show restraint or being detached from what is in the hands of people, and the people will love you. So not to chase after what the people have. If you rise above the need for taking from people, people will actually find you much more pleasant to be around because they don't fear what it is that you might take from them, what you might ask from them, etc. So being content with this, you should pay no attention to the praise or dispraise. In other words, their praise or dispraise should be completely equal. We've spoken about this idea before about not letting the creation's opinion or our status in their eyes or their opinion of us cause us to change the way we carry ourselves. Such that the example we've given many times is when you're praying and that you don't let the presence of others in the room affect you, that you should be with these others as you would be if it was a child or an animal, where they don't really affect your opinion or your status. What you do with your prayer, you don't lengthen your sujood because there's a cat walking through the room or a baby laying on the couch. You don't do much, you don't change anything because of it. You're not even thinking about it unless, of course, they're crying, and then you can't help but think about it. But you don't let it affect the quality of your worship. It doesn't factor in, and we should treat the rest of humanity, the rest of creation in a similar fashion, that we don't allow them to get into our hearts in such a way. So that, if you pay no attention to it, then you're going to be safe, because Satan never leaves him alone with worshiping Allah, always attacks him with thoughts so that they may render his worship fruitless. For example, he says he's distracted by the idea that people are observing his worship. He may say to himself, this is the reminder, this self-talk that you could have while praying. It says, it does not matter whether they know or do not know about my worship, for Allah knows best about it. So what was supposed to be gained because of anybody else knowing anything about it? This was like what we were referring to earlier, is that they have no control over benefit or harm. So they're knowing or not knowing that you're praying or how you're praying, it has no benefit or no harm in your condition. It doesn't matter. Whether or not Allah is pleased with what you're doing, that is the ultimate objective and the ultimate goal. And if you're looking for successful transaction, your transaction is with Allah. It's not with the creation. They're all businessmen like you. They're looking to make an exchange as well. So they're your competition. You don't want to try and work with them. You want to work with the one that the benefit is taken from. And so you focus on that. And so all of this is very important. He talks about also, and just so that we can finish off this chapter, he makes some other comments about showing good deeds and hiding evil ones may be legally permissible. Is that showing our good deeds, we talk about concealing them, and that one of the greatest means of protection is to hide our good deeds as much as possible, is have those private moments when we're worshiping where no one else can enter into the act of worship that we're doing. But sometimes displaying one's good deeds is good, and he mentions examples from the Salaf, the righteous from the past, how they would do some of their acts of worship in the open so that people could see it, in order to encourage others to do acts of worship, because they realize that people may see them and be influenced by that because of a particular status. That's why they'll say sometimes, like a scholar or a sheikh, they should be open about certain things, because people look at them as a symbol or a status for them to be encouraged or to be motivated to do extra than what they're doing, because they see that and they feel motivated for it, etc. But then also the hiding of good deeds. He mentions here a statement from the Prophet that is authentic, mashallah. He says, let him, whoever commits any of these dirty acts, cover himself under the cover of Allah, glorified and exalted. So this is alluding to the idea that covering one's sins, concealing one's sins, is something that's actually desired, so that you don't make a publication of your sins. This is in contrast to, of course, the stories we know, like Al-Ghamidiyya, when some of the companions, males and females, came to the Prophet and admitted openly to the zina that they had committed. And they were insistent upon it. Even though the Prophet tried to give them an opportunity by turning away, they were insistent upon it. This is an exception to the rule. It's not actually the norm. The norm is to actually keep that between you and Allah, so that you're in the hands of the mercy of Allah and you're not entering into that, and that then you allow that to be that case. And this is an encouragement for it from the words of the Prophet ﷺ, that whoever commits any of these dirty acts, it doesn't even name the act. And this is one of the habits of the Prophet. When it came to evil things, he wouldn't mention them. So like when you look at the hadith of intentions, he says the one who made hijrah in order to take a piece of the dunya or to marry a particular woman, then his hijrah is for whatever he migrated for. He didn't even repeat the conditions that he had mentioned. He didn't repeat them again as he did in the beginning. Who made hijrah for the sake of Allah and his messenger, then your hijrah is for Allah and his messenger. He repeated it because it's praiseworthy. But then in the second half, when he says the one who made his hijrah in order to take a piece from the dunya or to marry a particular woman, then your hijrah is for whatever you migrated for. He doesn't mention it because he's showing that it's dispraised. It's not something worthy of mentioning more than necessary. And so this is one of those qualities that we're trying to not state these things outright if we can. Vile speech or crude speech is not something praiseworthy in most circumstances. And so even here, the Prophet ﷺ is saying, any of these dirty acts, then you should cover yourself with the cover of Allah. Sitra of Allah. So this is, though disobedient, he still love Allah and his faith is still inculcated in his heart. So you inculcate this in your heart. And lastly but not least, acts of worship can be stimulated by the observation of other people. And so they cautioned here just the idea that we can, when we're with a group of people, be motivated to do certain acts of worship that we might not be as regular doing in our private times. And that this is good, but we should try and always still be mindful of not letting it be purely from a sense of Riya, is that this isn't automatically Riya, but it's something that you have to weigh. So that the example that he gave was if you're with a group of people and you're encouraged to pray extra voluntary prayers or something when you're with them, is that you try and do it in such a way. The example he gave was to stand in such a way that you can see them, but they can't see you. And so you continue to pray, you're motivated by their prayer, but you try to conceal your prayer even from them, even though you're with that group at that time. So you're trying to be always guarding of that and trying to guard the sincerity that comes with that intention, inshallah ta'ala. So that's the end of that, inshallah. Next week we'll begin the new chapter, which is on kibr, or pride. And we'll be talking about pride then for a few weeks, inshallah ta'ala. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. And there is a little bit of tea for those who are interested.